Okay, class. In this lecture, we're going to discuss social media for knowledge translation. This is an area that's a particular interest of mine across many different domains, both as a scientist and as a clinician, as an educator. So, some of the objectives, we'll go over the appraisal of the dissemination process for scholarly publication, some of the ramifications of the insular nature of academia and research. We'll go over some of the trends in social media use, as well as getting into the kind of the soup and nuts of what we'll talk about, which is social media for knowledge translation. So again, always kind of covering the scope of the issue, what may contribute to it, and then like how do we actually address it. So the first thing I want to touch on is just, again, the current state of scholarly dissemination. So you may have heard of the kind of passing term for academia, the ivory tower here that we've got an image of. This kind of traditional, closed door approach to how knowledge is both produced and how it's disseminated. Here's an image courtesy of Texas Tech of what I think most people think of when they think of researchers and academia, a bunch of old guys kind of sitting around in their suit jackets, smoking a pipe, reading over erudite scholarly publications, and kind of keeping things within that closed circle. And as someone who's written quite a few papers now, has edited, served as an editor for a journal, as well as reviewed for quite a bit of journals. Like the distribution process, the dissemination process for scholarly products or for the knowledge we produce to be translated, and we'll get into that later, is closed, right? So in general, the papers, when you write them, are written by researchers to be read by peers within their field. Like when I write a paper for respiratory physiology, I'm typically writing it for other respiratory physiologists. I think I've gotten a good bit of credit that my writing is a little bit more easy to read, but I'm not writing for the public. I'm writing for that particular audience, which is fair, right? Again, that's it's kind of the name of the game for what you're doing in academia. We'll get into some of that. How do we incentivize this later for knowledge producers? And then even the review process, it's done by other peers. So I'm writing for my peers. My papers are being reviewed and edited by peers in my field. And then when I'm publishing in a journal, typically reserved for people with access, of which many are your fellow peer scholars. So it's this kind of closed loop that I'm writing papers not intended for the public. They're going to be reviewed, again, like for substance and validity and reliability and even utility, like usefulness, by fellow peers. And then I'm going to be sharing it in, platforms that are really primarily designed for people in that field. Like even clinicians, it's not a guarantee that they have access to I know it is. I actually received some of the larger groups for PT, and it's not a guarantee that people have access to published literature, even if they're a practicing clinician. Unless you're working in a hospital-based system or a federal-based system, you might not have access, maybe through your society, but that's only some of the journals. Again, this is not even notwithstanding, just again some of the problems that exist of who funds research. Primarily in the States, it's taxpayers, right? The NIH gets their funding from taxpayers. Then you think of so the people are paying for the research primarily, and I think the NIH has done a good job now with the Library of Science of making funded research publicly accessible, but still kind of catching up in some areas. The other side is who thinks of the questions, right? I mean, the NIH does have usually a representative from the public, but primarily who decides what research is to be produced are by this same closed network. So again, just appraising that, the stakeholders, right? They may not always be kind of in, and that may even include clinicians. So just something to think about, right? And even kind of an interesting part as well, and we'll get into maybe this a little bit later, that the quality of scientific writing has actually gone down over time. There sometimes are overly verbose, full of jargon, even for clinicians, someone who's well educated and particularly in the sciences. We're finding that the quality of writing in many papers is just not what it used to be. So it's something to think about. And again, what does this lead to, right? So the other side is we produce a lot of knowledge. There's 28,000 active scholarly peer-reviewed journals. There are 2.5 million articles published per year, and this is data going back to 2016, right? It's probably even higher now. New journals come up every year. 1.29 biomedical journals published per minute if you average it out over a year. So a million clinical trials, and the knowledge base basically doubles every 10 years. So just thinking again of like how much just information. There's a large volume. It's not typically written for people in practice, let alone the public. And it's just limited access. There's just an overwhelming amount, and even the information they get isn't necessarily applicable. So we see this knowledge gap, right? This whole mantra that it takes 17 years for research to get practice, that does have some validity to it. And a lot of it, especially now, is just due to that. If you don't have a systematic way for appraising the literature, it's drowning almost. It's in how much exists and is produced on a daily basis. It's actually a bit of a problem in scientific publication, just the overwhelming amount of information that's out there. Again, thinking of who is writing this information and who are they writing it to. So if you look at providers, and I focus on providers quite a bit, and we'll get into kind of why later on, but I think providers, healthcare providers, have a unique role in disseminating information out to the public as well, because they know their communities a little bit better. They know, if you look at messenger to messenger kind of constructs, if you are immersed in your community like most healthcare providers are, they live in the geographical space of where they're practicing, especially primary care and even rehabilitation professionals, especially rehabilitation professionals like PTs and OTs. They're spending considerable amounts of time with their patients. They have an opportunity there to really educate. So I think focusing on some of the barriers to providers is well noted. So when we find that looking at providers, the most frequently reported barriers or walls, a little homage to Game of Thrones, the wall, is a lack of time, which makes sense, a lack of an inability to understand statistics, a lack of support from employer, a lack of resources or payroll. We talked again, even if you work, you're a licensed provider, you may not have access to all the journals. A lack of interest, again, think of how these papers are written, and a lack of translatable results, right? Again, when I'm writing a question, it's not necessarily directed towards practice per se, and sometimes it's even just a lack of understanding of how to apply a clinical trial to practice, realizing that clinical trials try to limit, have very high internal validity, very limited external validity. They're designed for mechanisms. They're not designed to be taken word for word to practice. It's a mechanism, right, that we're identifying or elucidating. And then so if you don't have this systematic method, it's for determining what's relevant, what's not relevant, it can make the overwhelming amount of knowledge that's produced just something that creates anxiety, and people just stop pursuing because they're like, well, I don't even know where to begin, right? And if you look at some metrics here that clinicians report, and this is an ideal situation. I've actually surveyed this myself. It's nowhere close to 4.4 hours per week, but yeah, the ideal situation would be 4.4 hours per week. And again, we look at our metrics. We're talking about 1.29 per minute. So even if you spend 4 hours per week reading, there's no way you'll be able to keep up with everything. And clinicians tend to prefer things in summary form. So a lot of journals now are getting better at putting key points, and systematic reviews and guidelines have helped with that. But again, that's a part of the puzzle, right? I think we need to do a better job of finding a way to put information into in translatable, consumable pieces, so they can then translate that out there to their communities. And the good thing is, the majority of clinicians practicing have a positive opinion about evidence-based practice. Most people realize that staying current with the evidence, staying current with the literature, is really useful. It's valuable, helps improve their practice. It's good for their patients. So there's definitely a want, right? There's definitely a need, but because of the system, it's created a vacuum, right? And we'll get more into the this, and we'll see this kind of reoccurring theme, this vacuum, this void that's been created by the wants of different individuals and the lack of just what's available. So that was kind of the providers' issues in a nutshell. In the next unit, we'll get into some of the issues with the public, right? So again, I think providers have a unique role because of their role and standing in society and in their communities. But we also need to address the elephant in the room as well, like what's kind of the public's role in this issue and how we can maybe consider some of these things to address this issue going forward. So with that, we'll end here.